Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month will feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here is your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hi, welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Today, our guest is Melanie Goodwin. Melanie is an Amazon best-selling author, but it's under a different name, a multi-awarded singer, songwriter, composer, producer, creator of faith-based tools for resetting a stressed out or post-traumatic mind. She has spoken and performed internationally and has coaching certifications from Tony Robbins and John Maxwell. Sometimes called an artist or soul whisperer, Melanie loves painting, gardens, and lingering dinner party with friends. That's a beautiful bio, Melanie. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, you do have a book out now with your real name. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. And before we started recording, I told you I love the name. Can you tell the audience the name of the book and how the story of how that came up?
Sure. There are a lot of questions about that title. The book title is Resurrected Roadkill. And the reason I got the name, or how the name came about, is that if you're familiar with Dr. Bissell van der Kolk's book on trauma, all things trauma, how the body keeps the score, he has a checklist of how typical adult survivors of childhood trauma or developmental trauma, based on his framework, how their lives are affected across the lifespan. And when I read that list, I had experienced all but one. That I had not been incarcerated, thank God, but everything else was like, yep. And so I was at a very disappointed stage reading that. And I felt like my whole life had been shaped by events that happened before I was 3 months old. And because the trauma was super early and it was sustained. So I felt like just a smear on the street. I felt like, well, if this is all said and done and I didn't have anything to do with it or about it, and many of the effects sound permanent, I felt like roadkill. And that's when I plugged into my faith, and there were a few key verses, but one of them was that the same resurrection power that raised Jesus from the dead lives in us and is available to us now. And so on the end of I knew that I was not just better than before, I knew that I was actually a new person, someone that I've never been before.
Wow, that's so powerful. It really is. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. Is the trauma, that early trauma, something that you're comfortable with sharing with us?
Yeah, I am. It's really processed through. It's a simple thing, although it wasn't simple to go through. My whole childhood, my mom told me the story, and the whole family would sort of just like listen or maybe roll our eyes a little bit when we were teenagers. But she would say that when I was born, the hospital where I was born had a staph infection, and there were 21 infants. I was number 20 of 21. So right after I got in there, they discovered they had the staph infection. And out of the 19 out of 21 infants died, and they lost 2 mothers. So they lost 21 people. But my life was saved, and the baby that came after me was saved. But my experience for years was just hearing my mom talk about it. And of course, now that I've studied trauma so much, I realized she was processing her trauma, because part of what the hospital did, and this is the late 1950s, so Penicillin was experimental. It wasn't even fully released yet. But my parents gave permission to use penicillin because there was no hope outside of that in their mind. And I was lanced hourly for like the first 2 to 4 weeks. It's not exactly clear. But initially it was nurses. I was in isolation or I was being lanced. And then I was home and mom was the lancer, because they trained her how to lance the boils and drain the boils and all that. So I when my body healed and the skin started to look normal, I was probably, 4 or 5, maybe 6 months old, but I did not want to be touched. I was one of those baby. Yeah, right. I was one of those infants that are like famous from the Russian orphanage stories where they arch their back and just scream if someone just tries to pick them up. And I was very much like that. So the bonding that I had with my mom was pretty much non-existent. And one of the things on Bissell's checklist is defiant disorder. Well, I never had a diagnosis like that, but I was definitely labeled the problematic child, because every time someone would like grab me by the shoulders or get close into my face or just touch me and hold me, I remember that I felt terrified. I wasn't being bad or just willful. I was fighting for my life. And so I bit people, I kicked them. I remember kicking fast and kind of honing a skill of just really rapidly kicking and biting so I could get loose from them. And so by the time, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3, I was the black sheep. I mean, like black as black can be. And so that kind of defined my whole early life.
Well, what's crazy about this story is literally every baby around you in the nursery died, except the one that came after you. I mean, that sounds crazy traumatic to me. Then go ahead.
No, well, I was going to, I don't know how many people have a reference for this, but I had a profound prayer moment, and by the grace of God, I was able to remember, and I know it was accurate because I described the isolette to my mother. This is when I'm in my late 50s. And I said, Mom, I had this experience and I want to just check it with how you recall. And I described things. She goes, that is right. So what I remember from that prayer time was the Lord was present with me. And so there was a securing, comforting presence, but I was also finally having access to what I believe are stored memories. And I just heard the raging and the screaming of other infants. And the raging would die down on some, and then it would be whimpering. And it was either rage or just sorrow. And it was a horrible thing to be surrounded by. And it went on for days and days.
Yeah. It's wow. Well, I have your book now, but I have not read it yet. I'm assuming you tell this story in your book.
There. Yes, it is. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing too that stuck out for me when you shared that was, of course you would repel people because your early touches you were being hurt. The lancing.
Yeah.
That's not very pleasant. So you were born already seeing and feeling and experiencing that the world wasn't safe for you as a baby. Coming in.
That's exactly right. And in terms of when we talk about brain imprint, I mean, that is definitely how I was. And even, I mean, the world was just not trauma informed, that many years ago. And so I understand looking back on it that I needed help, but I also understand that nobody else understood that. Everybody, children are resilient is kind of what we hear people say. And I don't think anyone was thinking gee, I wonder if this has to do with, those first few months that were so, so difficult. But whether they were thinking that or not, there wasn't any intervention that really helped. And it was no one's fault. I mean, everything that was done to me, I even hesitate to put it that way, because it was all it was to help me. It was to save my life. So just one of those bizarre circumstances where it was traumatic, but no one was, being horrible by any means.
Well, it's just like one of my worst nightmares is like serious burns, because that when they described like the burnt skin removal, I just don't know how. My heart breaks for people that go through that, and I'm sure it's painful like that. When it comes to your skin. Anyway, I'm so sorry that was your experience, and I'm glad God was there with you in the nursery. You're clearly were meant to be here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that was actually another stage, because I formed the impression, having heard that story all my life, I formed the impression that I'm not supposed to be here. And I mean, that is phenomenally strong for self-canceling, right? If you believe that you're just not supposed to be here, there's nothing you can do or say.
Well, see, I hear it as you were meant to be here, because you were one of true survivors. That means you're meant to be
Yes.
on this earth.
Thank you.
But you saw it the other way for a while.
I
Well,
did.
because you got that reinforcement though, because you were repelling people, so they were repelling you. So that's probably
Yes.
a lot to do with it.
Yeah. And in terms of that one very, very profound healing or prayer moment, what I was asked by someone who was praying for me, they said, do you see, or do you perceive that you have made any decisions, or are there any vows, or is there anything that has come from this that might be lingering? And the thought that came was, I'm not supposed to be there. They all died. I listened to them die. And I remember very clearly really loving the final silence. I'm a tiny infant, right? I didn't understand that it meant that one by one they had passed away and they were removed. I was just very relieved that it was finally quiet. But I also somehow formed this idea that I shouldn't be on the planet. And that was obviously a major healing moment, to realize that, no, my life was spared. I'm meant to be on the planet.
Well, I'll have to say your story is not one I've heard yet.
Well, yeah, I would imagine so. But, there in traumatology, there is a new emerging field of NICU trauma, because they don't understand what's going on. But obviously, there's an infant brain and it's learning.
In a body, the body doesn't forget anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. So,
well, they even know in utero too. In utero,
exactly,
the baby can be under major distress if the mother's under major distress.
Yep. All those things. So they'll understand it better in the future. But thankfully, with God, he understands it all already. We don't have to wait for science to catch up.
So how was school for you with that early trauma and being a child that was kind of rebuffing people? How did you do in school?
I think I did pretty well. I always had good grades, but my internal experience of being in school was just always on the outside. Like I always felt outside. I don't know if it was true or not true, but I felt outside my family. I just lived feeling, I don't know how to describe it except to say that I did not have a sense of belonging anywhere.
So you felt alone?
Yes. Yeah.
How did that look like to other people? Were you bullied at all? Did you have major
Uh,
depression? Were you an anxious kid?
I don't think I had any of those labels other than defiant. And that's when I was really small. Like I'm sure I was less than 5 or so. I don't think I experienced much bullying. I just know that some people thought I was aloof. Some people in later life have thought that it was a strength. And in a way, of course, it has been. I don't need to follow a crowd. I am strong standing on my own. But it's lovely to have a sense of belonging. And
Right.
that is not something I had early in life, but fortunately, I certainly know and have it now.
Yeah. How do you think that early trauma impacted your later development?
Later, like, do you mean like 20s and on, or do you
Yeah,
mean
yeah,
teens
20s and
or?
on. Well, like how it impacted maybe your relationships with other people, and then like
Mhm.
love and trust, and I think you said you had children and grandchildren. Like,
Mhm.
you know, did it make you a better mother and grandmother, or did you really struggle with parenting? Like, what was all that like for you?
I loved being a mom and a grandma, actually. I think being a mom was just, I think it's just one of the best. It is probably the best job on earth. I don't mean there are other jobs I don't love, but I loved being a mom. And in those years, I really was completely unaware of all this. The conversation we're having right now was completely subterranean
Yeah.
when I raised my kids. And so I wasn't experiencing any awareness of anything like that. But I will say this, I married 3 times, and I married three different people, but they were all sort of the same prototype. They were low. Well, I think the fair way of putting it is that there was a lot of poor communication. And one of the things that I had definitely learned was to just tolerate a lot of interpersonal conflict and low communication. And so that I found out after reading Vanderkolk, that was actually one of the recipes for forming a trauma bond. That's what made me very susceptible. All of my marriages may have been, I mean, I married everybody. I was raised pretty conservative. So I married everybody I got serious with.
Right.
And
I might
first,
really be able to relate to that.
okay. Yeah. And so, I mean, like the first 2 just didn't last even 4 years. They were over shy of that. But the third time I had become a Christian. And so I had this idea that it would work, and B, it had to work because I had too many strikes already. You know what I mean? But I married someone of a certain type that was definitely a trauma bond. And so going back to your question, just tying it back to how do I think I developed, I I think I did all right in the world, and I did okay in work, although I did not connect with work I loved. I love being a mom, and my relationship with my children is tight. However, I kind of married, even marriage and career, this would apply to both. I feel like I was sort of sleepwalking. Like I did not actually choose to be with those people. I was kind of following the script. I was following the imprint. And it's only since I've done all the work that I think when I form relationships with people now, I'm actually consciously choosing. And that has
Or
to do with,
intentional. Yeah.
yes, yeah, yeah. Otherwise, I was a sleepwalker and I didn't know it.
Yeah. Do you give yourself grace for those? I don't want to call them mistakes because we learn different things in these relationships. Now I forgot my original question. What was I trying to
Do I,
ask you?
do I give myself grace?
Yeah, like for
Mhm.
being in unhealthy relationships in the past.
Absolutely. The way I kind of imagine it, and I say this to other people when I teach, is we have to be gentle with ourselves. Like we have to have immense compassion. And for things that exist in the past, the only thing that we can do to shift it is release and forgive. Otherwise, I could be haunted by that stuff. And I was at risk for a while of being defined by that. And it's only by applying grace and saying, well, I was operating out of a pattern that I didn't even know I was in. So, yeah.
Because it's all you knew.
It's all I knew. It's all I knew, and it's all I expected.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like your faith was a pretty big part of your healing journey. What else was part of that journey for you?
Well, strongly connected to my faith is, and this might take a little explaining, the imagination, the way it's taught apart from faith, is that it's a human capacity for making things up. And I wouldn't say that's not true, but I would say it's incomplete. And the fuller understanding is that the imagination is an imaging and symbolic capacity given to all human beings for two-way communication. In other words, for downloads from heaven, downloads from beyond. And that is called a Christian understanding of the imagination. Or if you went to, university, they might call it the poetic imagination. And that was the number one way that I was able to receive healing, because either I was seeing visions in my mind's eye, or I was hearing, and I knew that I had developed enough discernment to know when I was just thinking something I was thinking, versus when I was hearing what I would call the voice of God. And so, and also I'm an artist. I'm a musician. I'm a composer. I deal in working from the imagination many hours of the day, right? So I understand when I'm accessing something that's outside of me. And that was, I don't, if you nodded when I mentioned Van der Kolk's book, but he talks about drama therapy, which is obviously a use of the imagination, because in drama therapy, sufferers will rewrite what happened to them with a better outcome, and it rewires the brain.
I love that.
Yeah. And that is a very positive use of imagination. And I used parts therapy, but I didn't use parts therapy because I never went to a parts therapist. What I did was I recognized that in the scripture, it says God desires truth in our inmost being. God desires truth in our innermost parts. And so I thought, oh, well, then that means I can take some of these exercises and write a letter or a dialogue between the adult Melanie today and the 2-year-old Melanie that was so terrified. And we can start to dialogue. And what it did was it brought a togetherness and a synthesis of all those parts. And to me, that is a completely biblical understanding of how God works in the soul.
It's really, really beautiful. Have you tried to teach that to other people?
Yeah, that's what the course is largely about. We have to start with the imagination because some people have been so trained to distrust their imagination that if they hear something that may be the voice of God, they will talk themselves out of it. Like, well, I just made that up. That couldn't be. So we have to start there. And then we go into parts, mapping the soul, mapping the parts, and then bringing reconciliation so that there's real integration within.
Okay. And where can people find your course? Or what's your course called?
Yeah, it's called Resurrected Roadkill, the course. It's on my website.
Like your book.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's on my website. It's currently waitlisted, but we're taking names for the next offering. So my website is melaniegoodwinstudios.com, and that's how they can get on the course list. And I must say, I mean, I am not a therapist. I'm not trying to be a therapist. I'm someone who loves God and believes in the power of God to address any kind of rewiring that the brain might need. But another really good use for parts therapy is for anyone who feels stuck. Maybe they don't think they have well, I didn't think I had a history of trauma much either, but if someone really doesn't have a history of trauma, but they're stuck, that's a great application for parts therapy the way we do it too, because it's all about, there's some kind of cognitive dissonance, and we have to take that apart, but we want to be gentle with ourselves. So what is that part that is at odds with the very goals we want to pursue? We need to identify that and have some dialogue. So it works for blocked artists as well.
Yeah. And for our listeners who are wondering about parts work, the original guru for that is Dr. Richard Schwartz. So we'll have a note to his book in the show notes as well. I'm guessing you've read The Artist's Way?
Yes, I've led Artist Way groups many times.
Okay, yeah. I'm working through it now. I've been needing to work through it for years and years. It was always on my bookshelf, but God kept keeping my eye on that book. He's like, you've got to. And so I listened. Well, I resigned from my full-time job, and then that gave me this space to work on my creativity. And my eyeball went right to there. So yeah,
yes.
I'm working through that book now.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, people, they used to, that's how I got my nickname. The Artist Whisperer is leading Artist Way groups. But people used to ask me about it because I was eventually modifying it and to include more faith-based material as well. And they used to say, I haven't taught a live course since before COVID, right before COVID was the last time. And they used to say, are you saying that creativity is a tool for recovery, or are we recovering our creativity? And my answer was yes and yes.
Yes, I would agree with that 100%. Yes.
Yeah.
We actually, in my Bible study class last night, we were talking about creativity and the creator within us and having a discussion. So it's just so fascinating how God works. Like anytime you start looking into something, you're surrounded by it in conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my experience, even with you today. It's like, of course, we're talking about creative. And of course, she's a composer and a writer and a singer, and she makes courses. And I mean, I guess the question, and you love garden, like, and you paint, like, what is it you don't like to do?
Yeah, no joke, right? That is a problem. I have to make myself only paint on weekends. You know what I mean? And I have another boundary with myself. I have taken a few commissions, and I really love to do painting commissions, but I work as a musician and a writer. I work. I'm constantly acquiring new skills and up-leveling. And as a painter, I still work, but only as far as joy carries me. You know what I mean? Like I don't push it. And so that's how I keep that a break instead of another work lane.
Yeah, that for our listeners, that's huge too, because one of the symptoms of being a survivor is keep putting things onto our plate, so we don't have time to think about our traumas. And also, it's almost like a punishment not allowing ourselves time to play.
Mm-hmm.
So you know you're healing well when you allow yourself time to play and just be.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I understand, though, why so many people aren't. I mean, some people won't even allow themselves a few minutes of quiet. Like they can't stand it if the radio or the television or some kind of media isn't on. Because, God forbid they should have a moment with themselves.
And have to listen.
Yeah. But I understand why. I remember clearly thinking, if I turn toward this pain, will there be an end? Like, will there be an end? Because it seemed endless. And now I'm so happy to say, yes, of course there's an end. But it took a commitment to like, okay, I'm cleaning house. I'm chuckling because I wrote a song called Clean House, and it's all about facing this stuff. It's not about house cleaning.
Yes,
but
it's a nice metaphor.
Yeah. So I do understand. I have a lot of compassion for people who don't want to face it. But eventually what happened in my life was it was inescapable. I had to either face it or I was going to die.
How old were you at that point?
59.
Oh, you don't even look 59. So that happened yesterday?
Oh, that's so kind of you. Yeah, no, that was 7 years ago. And all of this work happened from age 59 to, I want to say, like maybe 62 or 63. But what I did is there's another piece of my story that is going to help make more sense of this. I was already in 2013, I was put into a disability program that was for total and permanent disability. I was not expected to recover. And so it was the first time in my life where I didn't have an expectation on me to earn, and I wasn't forcing myself to try to keep going. And now I had been sick, chronically ill for 60 months. That's the point when medically and legally it was allowed to say this woman is total and it's permanent. And so in a way, of course, that's, not good news when people say, you're on the way out. That's not great news, obviously. On the other hand, I believed God would save me. I had a lot of promises that had not been fulfilled, and I believed that I was not on the way out. And so then I came into this gift called the second chance life, where you've lived very, very close with, the way I like to put it is death was just across the street. It was just over there, it was just right there. and my regrets were, I had a relationship regret. I did not want to leave my children. I only had one grandchild at the time. I didn't want to be gone before any other grandchildren showed up. And then I had my life's work that I felt that I had never given myself to fully, and I didn't know why. And so that's what I started taking on.
All while you weren't feeling well?
Yeah. I made a list. My first item was I have to get physical recovery. And that took and when I say recovery, I just mean I stopped going down. And I did some really radical things because the medical doctor said, we can't help you. What happened was I had been exposed to radiation at radon gas, and it goes off in your lungs as like a gamma radiation. And so my lungs were messed up. I couldn't cross my own living room without getting winded. Singing was over. I thought all music was over because everything I did with music up until then was singing. And so it just looked like I was going to die in my early 60s. And as the saying goes, I was going to die with my songs unsung. And so I started doing a lot of fasting. And I don't, to this day, maybe people will have some different reactions, but I think it's out still. There's a Australian man who made a video called Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead. And what he did was he took green juice and fasted for 60 days, and he turned his health around. And so I didn't last anywhere near 60 days, but I fasted a long time. And it was the first time that I stopped getting worse. And every time I ate or broke a fast, I had an immediate return of symptoms. But I just kept going on food and off food and on food and off food for about 7 or 8 months. And every time I was getting stronger and better And I couldn't have done that except that I was desperate and I knew I wanted to live. And it was the only thing that helped.
Now that's another story. You've got some good stories.
I guess. Yeah, I didn't plan on saying that, but that is how I stopped this. I mean, it was just a march toward death. It was just an unstoppable march toward death. And I mean, I still credit God, but the wisdom of the body is pretty awesome, right? Apparently, if you just fast, it has a repair mode. The body is either digesting or it's repairing. And if you don't take on food for a while, it gets to really go into hyper repair. And
especially American food that's full of preservatives.
that's true. But even when I broke fast, I didn't go eat at, an In-N-Out, or I didn't go to and I'm not picking on In-N-Out. I didn't go to any kind of fast food. I always make food from scratch, don't have a lot of poisons in it or chemicals, because I know that's what makes me symptomatic. But even like I could start wheezing if I ate an organic leaf of romaine lettuce.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah. So I just kept going back and forth between fasting and breaking fast because I needed to.
Right.
And it was kind of a radical approach, but people who want to live, I mean, you can do a lot of difficult things if you know you want to be around.
Yeah. Wow. So is that story also in your book, or are you writing more books?
I do have an idea for the next book that I would like to write. That story's not in the book. That's just coming up in conversation.
Well, I don't know if you want to write about it, but I really loved hearing it, if that helps.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
That is an interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, people, sometimes we just need to hear that hope is there, and it can look outside of the box.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's actually why I wrote the book that I did, is because I know that I felt very, like I said in the beginning, I felt like roadkill. I felt like all these forces came at me when I was young and didn't have any mechanisms for processing any of it, and it shaped me my entire life. And now life is ending, like that's it. That's why I felt like roadkill, because I was physically sick and I was told I'm on the way out. And I thought, no. Kind of imagine like if you go to a Disneyland and you ride a ride and it's over too quickly. You know what I mean? It's like, no, it can't be ending now. But times a million, because it was life it wasn't just a ride, it was life. And so first I thought, well, on the one hand, to live, I forgot how Paul put it, the Apostle Paul, to die is gain. Like if I live, I'd like to live. I really would. I had a lot of reasons to stay alive. But on the other hand, it's like I had an assurance that I would be with the Lord in heaven, and that didn't sound bad at all. But I had too much unfinished business. And the other thing, and I know people say, oh, the only thing when you're facing death, the only thing people think about is their family. And yeah, loved ones are absolutely number one. But if I'm honest, I also thought, no, I have unfinished work. I never brought forth my life's work.
Which was meant to happen, clearly.
Yeah. And that's the artist, so as a mother, absolutely, I had things I definitely wanted to stick around for. And as an artist, I did too.
Your story is pretty inspiring. You know that, right?
Yeah. Well, that's why yeah, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say, I think the audience is really going to enjoy hearing your story, and I hope they purchase your book and look at your class. It's pretty cool that you have a wait list. Is that because you narrow the number?
It is. It's because, at least so far, I really want to work pretty closely with people. I mean, if we're
Mhm.
mapping the soul, the history of spiritual direction or a spiritual coaching or anything like that, but spiritual direction goes back in the church, all the way to Christ, right? And so that is a tradition that doesn't put 500 people in a classroom, right? And it's something that is really best processed with a decent size group. And so I don't know what the ideal size is yet, but I don't want groups to be too big.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful experience. Yeah.
Well, I know it certainly has been for me, and there are definitely people who've had some real significant pivots in their lives. And I didn't craft those. I just know how to offer the coursework. And when people apply themselves to it, they realize, oh, I want a course correction in my work or in this relationship or, with something else. And so it's beautiful work. I believe it's holy work. I really do.
Really do too.
Yeah.
Well, Melanie, I'm really and have enjoyed our talk today. We probably, in the interest of time, need to wrap up. It looks like we've been going for a minute. Where can people find you again online?
Oh, they can find me at melaniegoodwinstudios.com. And a link to the book is resurrectedroadkill.com. And I just want to thank you. It's been a pleasure to meet you. And you're right. I mean, the whole reason for all of this is to say, even if there's a horrific trauma or some horrific history of harm, there's all kinds of reasons for hope.
Yeah. And I do want to say too, we didn't even talk about all of Melanie's traumas. She mentioned some before the call. So, I imagine they're in the book, or you'll just have to work with her to learn more about how she's recovered and healed using her faith and other tools, including like imagination, which is another tool from God. So it's really awesome. I am working on that tool as well. I'm probably not as good at it as you are. I don't know. Maybe we'll see.
I don't know. We all get an imagination.
That's
Every
right.
one of us. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much again for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.